Good morning, everybody. We'll get started momentarily. There are some stragglers we want to get in the room. All right. Good morning. My name is Lisa Feuerberg. You have me today rather than George Linares. He is out. So we're at the last Tech Topics for 2019, and we'll be discussing 3 topics today. We'll be speaking to LDAP, or Light Wet Directory Access Protocol Modernization. We'll be talking about System Census. And then we will have a recap of the recent Data API Summit, with a focus on APIs. Not to say that we won't talk about data there, but we are going to be talking about some API efforts there. So, can you move? So one of the things that we've been doing for the past few months is some live polling. And we would like to get our attendees' feedback on whether they like the session that they're attending or not. So it's very quick, it's very easy. We're going to pop this slide up after each of the presentations that are happening, and you can vote, either by web or by your phone. And there's a rating from 1 to 5, 1 being very satisfied, 5 being very dissatisfied. Good, I did read that correctly. So your text is CMS 2019 to 22333. And if you're doing it by web, it's pollev.com, and then you enter CMS 2019, and you make your respective selections. So without further ado, we will begin with Dave Paradis and his team to talk about the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol Modernization. Thank you.
There we go. Much better. Thank you. Good morning and welcome to the Tech Topics presentation on the CMS LDAP Modernization. Some introductions are in order. I'm David Paradis, just call me. I'm the project lead for the LDAP Modernization. We have Jeff Douglas here. He's the LDAP manager from NGS. And Nick Collingham down there on the end is the LDAP architect from NGS, working on the modernization effort. At CMS, LDAP is used every day. Oh, it flipped. The Lightweight Directory Access Protocol is an application protocol, along with endpoints, for accessing and maintaining distributed directory information services over an internet protocol network. At CMS, LDAP is used every day for authentication of servers and applications. Thank you. Identity data to include extended attributes, and group data. Further, LDAP provides these services to a myriad of consumers. Among them are application developers, system administrators, system architects, business owners, and system maintainers. And among the user accounts that LDAP serves, we have EUA, EIDM, we have CMS employees, contractors, and providers. And We'll pass this along to Nick Collingham. Or Jeff.
Thanks, Dave. So this is a high-level overview of LDAP at CMS. It depicts the relationship between the different systems. So first of all, we have the accounts, the user accounts are created within EIDM and EUA. This information is updated to LDAP so that it remains in sync with EUA and EIDM. For example, if a user was to change their password in EUA, that password information is updated to LDAP so that when that user goes to log into their application, they're able to authenticate with their new password. LDAP will also provide authentication, identity data, and group data to different applications. Applications can be integrated directly with LDAP, or as you can see from the diagram, we can also create an SSO environment that will support multiple applications authentication to the LDAP environment. Active Directory is a different directory service that provides specific authentication for specific systems, such as laptops and desktops or Active Directory integrated applications. Active Directory is also created as an endpoint within EUA, so that as user information is updated within EUA, it is then replicated and updated in Active Directory as well. So the current environment at CMS is very large with equipment at each and instances at each of the data centers. It's a very large multi-master LDAP environment, which means that all of the instances across all of the VDCs are kept in sync. As you can see from the diagram, each data center has a redundant copy of, we just lost our screen. There we go. There we go.
It's back.
I'll just turn around, right? So each of the VDCs has redundant local instances of LDAP. And while this has worked effectively, it's not the most efficient way to deploy LDAP services, as it creates a large number of instances and a lot of management across all the virtual data centers. It does provide high availability through local failover, as each data center has a redundant set of LDAP instances. So but it does not provide enterprise failover. So if both of the instances in a particular VDC was to go down, then the applications in that VDC would not be able to authenticate to LDAP because they do not have the ability to go outside of that data center and across to other VDCs for authentication. Also, the existing software, the Oracle LDAP environment that we have in place today is approaching its end of life. So as the current Oracle product is reaching its end of life, the LDAP Modernization project is an effort to replace the current Oracle product with Radiant One from Radiant Logic. Our plan is to create a parallel implementation of LDAP, which will support development, validation, and production environments. All of the data will be migrated, including user, group, and role data, as well as schema and access controls. That will all be migrated into the new environment. We will be creating a bi-directional synchronization between the existing we'll call it old LDAP environment, and the new solution. This will allow us to make sure that all of the data remains the same in each of the environments. That provides us with a couple of benefits. One is it reduces the risk on the project, because as we're migrating applications, should we migrate an application to the new environment and run into any issues, we can simply point the application back to the existing LDAP environment with limited impact. The other benefit of having all the data be the same across both LDAP environments is the ability to migrate applications independently and individually. So even because the data is the same across both LDAPs. Even supporting applications can be migrated independently and can be migrated on their own schedule. And because all the data is the same in each of the LDAP environments, they can all still communicate with each other. So only after all applications have been migrated to the new environment will we begin looking at the decommissioning of the current Oracle system. Our plan is to wait 2 to 3 weeks after we have migrated the final application successfully before we begin starting the process of retiring the Oracle systems. We also have the ability to reduce the LDAP footprint using virtualization, using virtual servers, and virtualizing all the different LDAP environments like enterprise, portal, legacy. We are able to consolidate them into one set of systems and one connection. We've also architected the new LDAP environment to provide failover across the enterprise, while still reducing the footprint and reducing the number of LDAP instances in the environment. This will obviously will reduce the equipment cost and also reduce the ongoing maintenance cost. So let's talk about why we chose Radiant Logic. We conducted a POC with several different LDAP products to try to identify the one that best fit at CMS. We decided that Radiant Logic with the benefits that Radiant Logic offered, that was the best solution. First, let me say that the first priority of our first goal of our LDAP modernization project is to provide like services. The same services that we're providing today with the Oracle product, we want to be able to provide tomorrow with the Radiant Logic product. Therefore, there are some features that are available, some of the new enhanced features that are available within Radiant Logic that will not be implemented initially, but will be available for future integration. One of those areas is virtual directory capabilities. Radiant allows the ability to provide identity aggregation and correlation across multiple data stores, LDAP, Active Directory, SQL, and APIs. And they're able to create unlimited virtual views to meet application needs without changing the underlying data stores. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we have the ability to use the virtual directory capabilities to consolidate directories, to be able to take multiple directories and virtualize them and present them as one connection that we can get to. In addition to LDAP services, Radiant Logic also is capable of providing SQL and web services interfaces for future integration opportunities. From a cloud integration capabilities standpoint, Radiant has the ability to synchronize on-premises identity stores with cloud-based stores such as Azure or AWS. We can create consolidated views of multiple identity stores for single sign-on. We can also provide identity as a service. And by this, what I mean is to create a one-stop shop for identity. Because of the virtualization, and we can pull together all of the different data stores across the environment, we can then provide a single point of entry to access all of that data. Nick?
Sorry, my fingers are too big. So the LDAP architecture for the new modernization environment, essentially what we did is we limited it to 2 data centers. So for validation and production, those are going to be separate, and for the development environment, we do not have the redundancy that we built into the other environments. So a couple of important notes. The LDAP service is not internet accessible. It's a service that's consumed by 3-zone applications. So we don't have a presentation zone presence for LDAP. For the LDAP architecture, none of the applications will interface directly with the LDAP service. They'll be interfacing with the directory proxies that we have located in the application tier as well as the data tier. Applications are going to hit a front-end load balancer to load balance them between those proxies. For most applications, that load balancer will also failover between data centers. So for production, we'll have this infrastructure set up in both AWS as well as the BDC. At the load balancer level, if there's any failure with the local data center, it will fail over to the secondary data center. Again, all the clients are going to connect to a load balancer VIP. The purpose of this is if we ever have any changes to the underlying architecture, we need to add additional capacity or make changes, we won't need to impact each of those applications individually. As part of the infrastructure, we have the VDS configured as a proxy. The VDS has a couple of important features. One, of course, is the virtualization. The second is a proxy layer that allows us to route traffic between the different directory instances. We also have the HDAP, which is the storage layer. This is what we're using to replace the existing directory services. What we're doing is pulling all the information from these existing directories into this HDAP storage layer and performing that sync between the existing environment. We also have the ICS, which is not being used as part of the existing migration, but it will give us additional capabilities going forward for the more complex virtualization scenarios. There are 3 separate LDAP environments that we have at CMS. I know these don't always align with the multiple environments we have for application development, but we do have a development environment. This is for unit testing, application integration. We do not have redundancy in this environment. It's a single instance set up at the LMDC. We also have a validation/implementation environment. This is going to be used for our functional testing, user acceptance, and regression testing. This is an exact replica of the production environment, not from the data, but from the architecture standpoint. So when we do performance testing, we should expect the same results in production with what we have in validation. This is also where we can do security, performance, and reliability testing. Again, we have the failover between the 2 data centers here, and that's going to be AWS and LMDC for the implementation environment. And production is exactly the same, and that will be hosted in the BDC as well as AWS. This diagram looks a little bit familiar, but the biggest takeaway from what we showed previously with the existing LDAP architecture and the new is that we're now limiting the LDAP footprint to just the AWS and BDC environments for production. We won't have a full stack of the LDAP architecture at each VDC. But what we've done, we reached out to all the applications as for an application kickoff meeting, and what we found is there was a lot of concern without having a local LDAP presence, how each application would integrate with the LDAP service. So what we've been doing over the last month or so is working with each of the VDCs and extending the connectivity out to the application and data tier for each of these VDCs. So what we have now is a load balancer for all the applications that aren't hosting the LDAP service in both the application and data tier. And all the firewall ports, routes between the data centers and things like that are already in place. So when we migrate these applications, they don't need to worry about where the directory service is hosted. They just need to worry about their local interface, which is going to be the local load balancer and the hosting data center. So these services, as far as the load balancers that we have configured, we've got them set up, or we're in the process of working with Azure. We've got them set up in the Companion Data Services, CDS, the Leidos Managed Data Center, Perspecta, and in AWS in the Baltimore Data Center, of course, we have the full stack of the directory infrastructure. This active multi-data center design, it provides a built-in disaster recovery. So the LDAP service isn't reliant on a single data center to perform its duties. If one of those data centers goes down, we have the ability to continue operating. One data center can handle the full load of what we anticipate for the directory service transactions.
And I'll just talk about the modernization timetable. So we currently have 56 applications that we are working to integrate, that integrate directly with LDAP, that we're working to migrate to the new environment. We're working to be very flexible with our schedule and working around application teams to make sure that we can work their schedule into our schedule so that it works for them. We've defined 4 different application groups. We've taken those 56 applications and we've broken them into 4 groups, groups A, B, C, and D. We've also created a 5th group, and that purpose of that is for any additional time that any of the application teams may need for additional testing, or if due to other reasons the time frame doesn't fit for the first 4 groups, that they can then do their migration and testing in the final group. We've set up 2-week windows for the migration and testing activities in each of the 3 development, validation, and production environments. We are currently working with the Group A application teams in the development environment, and we in the coming days will be reaching out, and we've already begun to reach out, but in the coming days we'll be reaching out to the remaining application groups to work out what time frame would work best for them. Again, I want to point out that, or stress that this is really a framework. This timetable was designed to add some structure to the project, make it easier for us to schedule the applications and be able to make sure that things were moving forward. It is not set in stone to the extent that we will be very flexible with the application teams, work with each individual application team to figure out what time frame works best for them in their schedule based on the other things they have going on in their world. So we'll be very flexible. Nick?
So what's new in the new LDAP environment? So one of the biggest things that's changing is we're changing the product, of course. The Oracle Directory Server Enterprise Edition is going into life, and we'll be replacing that with the Radiant FID product. The next thing is the consolidated infrastructure. We are not going to have that local presence like we've had in the past for each of the data centers. There have been some concerns voiced about performance. We don't believe that's going to be an issue. We will be doing some additional performance testing when we get into the validation environment, and we encourage the applications that we'll be integrating to do the same. The LDAP connection information is changing. We went through several different ideas on how to do the migration, and what we settled on was an application-by-application integration so that the applications could make the changes necessary on their timeline, taking into account other priorities for them. So we will be pointing them to the new load balancer. Their host is going to change, their port's going to change. Additionally, we're going to be changing the type of LDAP certificates that we use. Previously, we had been using the semantic certificates. We'll now be using the HHS Intrust certificates. So that's going to require each of the integrated applications during the migration to update the CA certificates they have in their trust store. And also, we're going to a single virtualized view of the directory instances. Most applications are only aware of the enterprise LDAP. We have multiple additional application-specific directories that we provide. One is probably the most important is the portal. We also have what was the legacy in the INA directory and several others that we support. Going forward in Radiant Logic, instead of having multiple independent LDAP instances, we'll have one single view that will allow you to see all of them. So what we've done is the enterprise LDAP will remain the same. The additional directory server instances will have a new base DN to identify them. Everything else will remain the same. As you can see, the legacy or INA LDAP, we have in a separate OU called OU Legacy, same for Portal, and the other directory services that we offer. So the future. One of the main reasons we chose the Radiant Logic product was not for replacing our existing like-for-like services. There are multiple directories that we could do that we evaluated, and Radiant Logic was able to do that as well also. The reason we selected the Radiant Logic virtual directory was forward-looking. What we want to be able to do with all the different identity stores we have across CMS, there is a need to be able to provide a single view of all those identities that we have. We've got multiple identity management systems, different directories, data stores that are used by individual applications. This will give us the ability to create a single LDAP view of not only our existing LDAP stores, but Active Directory as well, databases if need be, application APIs to integrate with cloud applications like Okta, for example. We're also going to provide new client access methods. With the popularity of APIs, we also have the ability to provide the LDAP service as a REST interface in addition to the standard LDAP interface. And of course, the cloud integration support that we mentioned. We have a lot of flexibility with how we integrate these different data stores, and Radian really helps us with that. So how do we integrate with the new LDAP directory service? We've created an integration guide, and that's going to be hosted in the Enterprise Confluence. It's going to provide all the information that you need to integrate with the LDAP service. That's going to include things like the high-level architecture, as well as the connection information. As we mentioned, we've got a local load balancer configured in every data center. So how you connect, or what load balancer you connect to, depends on your host data center and your tier. So we'll have the listing in this integration guide that you can use to determine what your local presence for the LDAP service is. How to request the LDAP access, it's going to have the information in there for requesting a system account, which will allow your application to integrate with the LDAP service. It'll have the certificates that are required to make the SSL connection, as well as the contact information for the LDAP team. Important to note when integrating with the new service, there's 4 types of users in the LDAP system. The main type of user is the standard user. That's your typical LDAP account. These users only have read access for their own information and the ability to change their passwords. The next most common type of account is the system account. This is a typical account that any application would need in order to integrate with the LDAP service. This gives them the ability to read the information from users across the directory, as well as the group information. Additionally, we have the super user account. This is reserved for a few select cases, and that would be identity management systems like EUA and EIDM, and the ability to create accounts and manage those account life cycles in the directory. Typically, in addition to the identity management services, we would also allow this type of account on the application-specific directories, and that would be the directories like Portal or WODM and several others. And then, of course, the directory administrator. This is a root-type privileges, and these are only given to the CMS LDAP administrative team. Key resources on this. So from the CMS side, IUSG, Mark O is the business owner, Dave Paradise, of course, the project lead. From the maintainer side, it's National Government Services on the VISE contract. Jeff Douglas is the LDAP manager. Myself, I'm the LDAP architect, and Marin Selvaraj is the LDAP team lead. And for any information regarding the LDAP service, whether about the modernization effort or current LDAP, you can reach out to LDAP_engineering at cms.hhs.gov. Any questions?
So questions, anybody in the room? If you do, let's go up to the microphone, which I'm going to turn on so that everybody can hear you. There you go.
Yeah, hi. I'm just wondering, you talked about SQL, that you're going to have a SQL access, and with the API. Have you thought about what that might be used for? So that's question 1. 2, when you go to AWS, if you look at some of the base data store patterns, they've got all these different, like DynamoDB, Redshift, RDS, there's just a ton of stuff, right? So if you wanted to have a view into who had access to all of that data, how would this help with that? So those are my 2 questions.
Okay. Sure. So there's 2 different pieces, right? There's the front end and the back end. So on the front end, I really wouldn't see much of a need for the SQL interface, although it is there. So where I would see that being used is with some applications that may not have an LDAP interface, which wouldn't be common for most modern applications, but maybe for some COTS applications that have only an SQL connector, we could give them access to the LDAP data using that. We don't have that enabled out of the box. It's a capability that we have. We put it out there in case there is a need. You could share that with us. So on the back end is where it's important. So we can create connections to multiple back-end data stores that we pull into a virtualized view, an LDAP view of that data. So we can essentially, out of the box, do anything LDAP, SQL, and we can use anything that's got an API. We can write custom Java to connect into these things, leveraging their APIs. Right now, our back-end sources are only our existing directories, but we do have the capability to integrate with any of those. If there's an API or an SDK that we can use to integrate with these, the possibilities are endless on what we can have on the back end.
Okay, so we also have people attending remotely. So WebEx moderator, are there any people on the line that have questions? Would you want to open it up? Okay. Just want to remind everybody, let us know how we're doing. There's our live polling information. And I think that pretty much wraps you guys up then. So I want to thank you very much. And
Thank
we're
you.
going to bring up our next presenter, Mr. David Doherty, to talk about System Census.
Thank you.
Excuse me while I log on. All right. Welcome to the Enterprise Architecture section of the Tech Talks today. We'll be presenting on the fiscal year 20 System Census Survey.
David, can you move your up closer? Thank you.
How's this?
Thank you.
Oh. I'm going very quickly through the survey. There we go. Okay. Excuse me. So just to start, we should start with definitions. What is the CMS System Census? It is a survey of all of CMS's business applications. We've conducted this survey several times before in 2009, 11, 13, 15, 17, and last year. We are pleased to have achieved 100% response rate last year and the last few years, and we're hoping to get to 100% soon when the census is ending, because it is going on right now, and we have 12% of the systems completed, have passed, with about 78% of the systems actively participating in the survey right now. The survey is divided into 3 sections: a business owner section with 41 questions, a system maintainer section with 65 questions, and the TLC section. Okay. Okay, I will speak louder. So the census survey this year has 130 questions. And I need to do this. The System Census is a broad survey asking for information about several different aspects of each system, as shown as this image. I would characterize the survey as being broad but not deep, with only a few basic questions in each area, but a lot of areas. So the challenge for those of you filling out the survey is not doing deep research into any one of these areas, as it is identifying the right people from your team who can answer the questions for each of the areas. So it's a coordination challenge. There are 2 major changes to the System Census this year. First, we're integrating with the new TLC processes to have as much of the data collected in the survey reused by the TLC reviewers, so they don't have to ask you this information. TLC, for those of you who don't know, is the target lifecycle, which is the replacement for the XLC, the lifecycle, that governance lifecycle that's being revised at CMS right now and OIT. Additionally, we've added, in purple you can see in the graphic, 2 pages to collect TLC-specific information. From last year's survey, we conducted listening sessions with staff from 13 CMS components on how we can improve the survey. One of the themes that we heard was that the survey is too long. To address this, we conducted a complete audit of all of the questions in the survey and found alternative sources for many of them. We're working now to integrate with those other systems that have that information and have removed those questions from the survey. Even including the 24 new questions in the added TLC pages, overall the survey is 40% shorter. So why are we going through all this work to collect this information? Why do we have the system census? The CMS Enterprise Architecture Program is required by OMB and HHS CIO to maintain and update a system inventory with core system information. More than that, those requirements, we use this information constantly. Each month we receive about 9 requests for enterprise analysis information, totaling over 100 requests every year. So far we've received 114 requests so far in 2019. Half of these requests are for enterprise data that are for system inventory information, which is directly from the census. So we use this information. Many of the requests are to help CMS staff quickly respond to auditors and ad hoc reporting for HHS and OMB. Because we have this information on hand, we don't have to keep asking business owners for it as data calls appear each week. Also, we've used and shared this information with integrated project teams leading every critical initiative at CMS for years, including the new Medicare Card Initiative, SSNRI, the 504 Agreement, HITECH, QPP, and of course, ACA. Also, this information is available to any staff at CMS from the DEA SharePoint site, the Division of Enterprise Architecture SharePoint site, or you can ask for our information and we'll be happy to share it with you. So the value for CMS's major initiatives, I want to emphasize this a little bit. Supporting CMS initiatives is an important part of the value of the CMS system data, and it's an important part of our mission as enterprise architects. We've provided system information and other information to help every major initiative. The 504 agreement, the quality payment program, those things. The value of our data is not that we have the answers all ready to go for these initiatives from day one. The value is that if you think of the planning analysis that has to be done for these large critical initiatives, QPP, the HITECH, these kinds of initiatives, we have baseline data to help start these analyses faster. And they come to us constantly, and we interview with them constantly, so they get that baseline data. In the race analogy, we can help move the starting line to save time. So we can't get you across the finish line, but we can help move the starting line. This saves weeks, months, hundreds of hours of analysis that otherwise these teams would have to do the planning analysis that they need for their initiative. One of the big examples is the SSNRI, the new Medicare Card Initiative. We spent 2 years working with them while they did their audit of all of the systems at CMS to identify those that use SSNs and identify how much it would cost to remove the numbers from those systems. Having the system inventory, the census data, and the connections between systems, which is what I'm showing on the graphic here is our system interaction model of all the systems and all the 1,300 connections we've documented between them. They could trace, when they found a system that has SSN, Social Security number, they could trace all the systems that are upstream from that and all the systems that are downstream from that. So it was really valuable to work with them and help them set that baseline for doing their audit, which then fed into that first major budget request for paying for the cost of removing SSNs. So the value for system designers, we help with options on cloud service providers, and SaaS platforms that we have at CMS, data centers, BI tools, CMS portal, and we can look up the use of specific software products. We're the only major source of software lists at CMS for all the systems. We can also do data architecture analysis, data architecture advising, and data design and engineering. And this is one of our favorite diagrams that we've came up with early last year. The system cloud use at CMS is from our data from the census, and it's showing how much cloud use is increasing at CMS. And once we get the system census done this year, which is ending in 8 working days, once we get that data, we'll have another bar here, which will be very impressive, much higher. The values for business owners, some of you know that we've been doing business process modeling for over 10 years and have 1,400 business process models from CMS's various programs available on our SharePoint site at any time. We find opportunities for business owners that have to set up new systems and new programs and new processes. We can, let me wake up my screen here. We can show opportunities for reuse, for collaboration with other groups, and for support. My screen seems to have gone to sleep. Okay. And I'm going to leave it at that. You can contact us if you have questions about the CMS System Census or enterprise architecture services that we can provide. And I'll end before I ask for questions by advising that, again, we have 8 working days before the end of the CMS System Census. You can contact us to get started on your surveys. There are 35 systems that have not started, and we are eager to talk to them. Any questions? Okay, Paul.
Yeah, I saw that your systems interaction diagram was from 2013.
Yeah.
Any, now that we're moving more and more to the cloud, who's got what where? How's it all fitting together? I know that would be a massive undertaking, but have you thought about that?
So, 2 parts to that. I regretfully, I have to admit that we haven't updated it lately, and I'm eager to do that. It's just a time manifest to make the beautiful diagram. I know we have a whole list of people who want the latest poster of the system interaction model for their wall. But we do have the latest data behind it. So we have a spreadsheet with the 1,300 interactions, connections between the systems and our external stakeholders that you can download from our SharePoint site at any time. That is one of the most valuable parts of the system census, is showing who talks to whom, which systems and which stakeholders outside of CMS and other agencies talk to CMS. And if you're trying to do an impact analysis like SSNRI, you really need that. We haven't found so far, when people move to the cloud, that the interfaces change, how they do it change, but they still need the same data, and they're still sharing the same data upstream and downstream. We haven't found very much impact of that, but maybe we'll start seeing that with this year's census. Any other questions? Thank you, Paul.
Do we have any questions on the phone? WebEx moderator?
No question at this moment.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay. I want to thank David for coming and speaking to System Census. I know that the issue with reuse of the data that's already been input is a big focus here, and we'll see more modernization efforts around that as we get into 2020. So we'll move on to our next presentation, which is the wildly popular Data API Summit. We had our second one in October, and we're going to lead off with Paul Donahoe, followed by Yadira Sanchez, and then Manjuna Salamani. Thank you.
Yeah, let's make sure this is working. Although I come from the Jack Fletcher School of Broadcasting, and I've never been accused of not being to be able to be heard. Thurston can justify. Okay, so appreciate being here. see a bunch of folks I know in the audience. David, for those that don't know, that systems interaction diagram, when you first come to CMS and you're trying to figure out what's going on, this is a massive place. I had that diagram on my wall when I first started, and every time I would hear a new system, I'd go take a look and try to trace it through, and I found that to be highly valuable, so that is some really good work you're doing there. So, but today we're going to shift topics, but I did want to give a shout out, David, that's some very good work. Manjunath, Yadira, and I, we were all part of the Data Summit, and it was the second one, and we're going to try to see if we... Yeah, see, that's how it works. See, I brought Yadira to keep me straight because she has, I couldn't believe what Yadira has been doing on the API side. So we get to that because you did sort of blow me away a little bit because it's some very important stuff like data to point of care. I mean, sometimes you forget how important CMS is, but then when you hear, for example, that one API is like, wow, that really, I could see how, having my data at my doctor's office before I go there, well, they know what procedures I've already had so that doctor doesn't have to keep doing defensive medicine and giving me a procedure I've already had. That's just the way it is in America today. So I was just really impressed with some of what was going on there. And Yadira bridges the gap between APIs and data, so that was the other reason why you're here. So, but I just wanted to give a little background. I thought, I see Bobby Saxon in the back. Bobby was the co-sponsor of the first one. This is our second one that we just did. And you can start to see, just as David's picture is going to show next year, the migration to the cloud. It's happening. We're moving many systems to the cloud. For example, talking about Bobby in the back, the marketplace, we moved all of our major systems March of this year, end of March, we had all of our systems moved to the cloud. It was a very big lift. And now that we're there, we're settling in, and we're realizing that stuff like EFT, sending stuff, big files overnight, it's just really the cloud doesn't understand that over a lot. It's like, well, wait a minute, we can do that, but there's like all this other stuff you could be doing, and maybe you shouldn't be doing that anymore. So we're finally settling into seeing what is up there in the cloud, but you can see from the speakers, and we would have had a couple more. We would have had John Booth and maybe Mark Richardson, but open enrollment, we got to get our timing right next time. So we didn't, John's session last year was one of the highlights for me, at least. He's done some amazing work. But you see, we had all pretty much the major managerial and contractual and Fed leads on the data. Most of us were there or present and physically or dialed in. So we had a really good attendance. You can start to see, I listed most of the people organizationally and most of what we talked about, but there was a lot of talking in the halls. I know I still have a follow-up conversation with Steve Walters I got to finish up, stuff that I talked to you on the side. So we did a lot of that. There was just a lot of talking in the halls. And Jenny from CMCS, some of the work they're doing there with in AWS with the Lifeline API. So these are just some amazing stuff. So you can just go down there. Medicare payment, they're doing some API work there on the FIS, the Fiscal Intermediary Shared System. That's kind of a big deal because that system is coming from a COBOL and assembler point of view, and they're trying to work with digital services to try to figure out how to start piecemeal that. That was Oktar working with a bunch of folks there with John Evangelist. And it just goes down. So you see there was a bunch of stuff. If you got Manjunath here, because what we started to see too is that governance is going to become a big deal, right? So, okay, so we're going to understand the technologies. We're going to really start to understand that databases changed while we went to the cloud, that there is this thing called separation of compute and storage, that you can have multiple teams hitting the same data with Spark or Presto, and you've got a new one. There'll always be something new. But you don't have to degrade one another, and that's a first. We never had that before, with databases. So we all went to our corner because I wouldn't allow you to ruin my service level agreement, so we all went to our corner. So now that you have the potential to have data tapped into by multiple teams, both contributing it to that shared platform as well as taking it out. That has huge implications for us 5, 10 years down the road. We're starting to understand that, but we're not quite there yet. We have to build a little bit more show, don't tell. We have to have some examples that we can show people, in leadership that, yeah, you really can do this, and here's proof. Because until we can prove some of this, there's just too high a risk, and management will keep with more traditional patterns. But we're going to get into that. I think by next May, we're going to have some very interesting data architectural patterns that we've not seen before demonstrated in real life. Just sort of like I thought the coming out party for next generation APIs was this session. I mean, again, that data at the point of care was just, there was a bunch, Lifeline, there was just a bunch, but the data at the point of care was the one that blew me away. I was just like, wow, that could be a killer app. So, but anyhow, so that was where we came from. We're tentatively thinking May to do the next one. We'll have to see how that goes. And we would like to have a little bit more interaction and lead time so that, because it takes about 2 months of planning to get these things going. Maybe if we started in the beginning of the year, we can give ourselves 4 months and really see what's out there. But very pleased with where we're at. I guess you all can comment on it too. I just think CMS is really working very hard to learn new ways of doing business and reduce costs, increase security, all that. I thought we had Mark Hogel and George Linares at the end answer questions, and I thought they were just right on. So I think we have an engaged management team. I think we have a technical team that's after it. And, but it really is pointing to some very fundamentally different ways of managing data at CMS, and I think that's a pretty big deal. So without much further ado, Yadira, did you want to, so Yadira, she's got her team over there in the corner, and they're all just working heads down the whole time. I'm like, would you let those people work, pay attention a little bit? But you were working on some really important things, and then you went to the side on that white sheet of paper, and you started showing me the different APIs that you're working on, and I thought that was very important and just really fundamentally good stuff. So here you go, Yadira.
Steal your mic.
Yeah.
I'm going to steal his mic so he stops stealing my thunder and talking about the work that we've been doing. As Paul stated, one of the greatest benefits of the Data and API Summit is really just the collaboration and the communication that we have. I don't have any slides. I can talk endlessly without them, is the collaboration and communication that we have with other components at CMS that we don't always have an opportunity to work with, and just learn about what they're doing, how we can either mimic, copy, steal some of their ideas, and prevent ourselves from having to repeat the same mistakes that they've made. We started in 2018 in OEDA with the development of the Blue Button 2.0 API. For those of you that are not familiar with Blue Button 2.0, it was started primarily to put claims data in the hands of the beneficiaries. So an API was developed that beneficiaries authorize different applications to get access to. It is very unique at CMS in the way that we don't develop any applications to access this data. We've only developed the API, but we have worked with third-party applications in developing a variety of APIs to support the beneficiaries in getting them the claims data. These applications can range from research applications to healthcare EHRs that just display the claims information to the beneficiaries. It could be coverage determinations, where if a beneficiary wants to change their healthcare and during open enrollment, well, what claims did they have the previous year? What plans should they look at for the next year to try to get some cost savings? To date, CMS has over 54 applications that are connected to the Blue Button API, and over 40,000 beneficiaries have authorized access to that data. The other unique thing that we have done about this is really focus on standards. The API is developed off of the beneficiary FHIR data server, which is a FHIR-based API in itself that actually shares the information through the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Standards developed by HL7. Standard sounds like it's something that should be, something off the shelf that you pick up and you run with. When we started Blue Button, that was not the case. There have been a lot of evolutions and changes, so it's been a little difficult, but exciting because this year, as you guys know, CMS released the interoperability rule as well as ONC, and the use from our end of this beneficiary fire data server has grown exponentially. In this year, we launched a pilot to test data sharing of that same claims data through FHIR with accountable care organizations, and we have 10 ACOs in production accessing that data. As Paul stated, one of the things that we started looking at as well in this year was starting to share data directly with providers. This is something that CMS has not really done in the past, but we realize the value of a beneficiary going to the doctor for the first time. They already know what your claims history is. They see what medications you have filled. So the first visit isn't about what your history is, trying to remember everything that you take during the year, what procedures, what specialists you have visited. They have that information already in their hands. We hope to launch the pilot of that in this month or next month, crossing our fingers, and then we'll spend the next 3 to 4 months really evaluating the value that's provided with directly to the providers as well as the beneficiaries. The last API that we have developed is part of the Balanced Budget Act of 2018, and that really pushes sharing specific Medicare claims data elements with PDP sponsors, so that they can understand what treatment the beneficiaries are getting that the medications are prescribed for. And that API will launch sometime spring, summer of next year. All of this, again, is based off of the FHIR spec. Blue Button uses I don't know if you call it a basic FHIR spec, but it's individual claims data sent. Our other APIs are all using the bulk FHIR spec. CMS was the first to implement it. Again, lots of evolution and changes happening across the industry related to that. So CMS really has partnered with HL7 in trying to push those standards along, make sure that it actually includes everything that we need. And so that's where we are today. Paul cornered me during the Data and API Summit and wanted to learn more information, and he thought that you guys might be interested in learning a little bit about what we've been doing with CMS's data as well. So that's it.
Well, it's also the fact that, CMS new relationship with the provider, you're going to set an example for the private sector as well, and for people like Kaiser and others, right? So that's what I'm saying, is that was like who knows when the next killer app's coming, but that one might be it, right? If you could see how it's just a workaround to get our data integrated a little bit. So, I was going to pass it on to Majnat. Before I do that, there was really two other big things that happened that I thought about. One was, I think, a week from today, November 20th, CCSQ is going to lay Medicare claims data in S3 for wide sharing amongst itself using that Spark kind of presto magic where separation of compute and storage, the same data can be tapped by many systems. And what they did is they created the final action as a service. So for some of us that have been here for a while, the Medicare claims is our #1 bestseller. It's also very large. We've got it in dozens and dozens and dozens. I could probably list at least 36 or so. I mean, I don't know what the number is, but I think I can go on and on and on about all the copies of those billions and billions of rows that are stored, maybe the same, maybe not. Maybe they're linked the same, maybe not. So you can start, and then maybe the final action. And what happens with a claim, the final action is, as a claim comes in, it can be a change, an update can come in a week later, and then an update to that. And so what the final action does, it takes the debits and the credits, and it's sort of, for here in this point in time, this is what the claim looks like. There's more than one way to doing that. So anyhow, so the idea would be is if you had the data in one place, with one set of rules, at least you'd be consistently wrong, right? Or maybe right, consistently right. But at least you're consistent. And so we don't have that today. So that I wanted to give Ken and Injury a shout out. That was a pretty big deal what they're working on over there. That's coming this next week. Next Thursday is supposed to be the day that goes live. Very big deal. The other one is I talked to Ashley and Todd. Ashley is with CMMI, and we asked them to come because we wanted not just to hear what people are doing, but what do people need. And so they did a real nice job of summarizing some of the data that they need, which we thought was sort of important for the architects in the room to hear what there's still unmet need out there. So we asked them, and then I'll just, before I pass to Majna, she said, about every 12 years, because she's been around a little bit like I have, and she goes, every 12 years it seems like we have to do a new sort of reset and rethink of what our next generation modernization should be. And I thought that really, along with your presentation, really was something that stayed with me, is that I think we're on the cusp. In the next year or two, we're going to have to lay down a more serious, focused strategy, whether it's organic, coming up from the bottom or from the top or some sideways. I think we are at that point where we're going to have to do something different. And that is a good lead into Majnath, because he's going to get into what that next generation pattern might be, where we could have data in one place accessed by many systems for both operations and analytics. That's the other point. It's not just analytics. You can have operational systems tap into the same data.
I think this works.
You work? Okay.
All right, so good morning, everybody. Manjunath Salamani. I support George and Steve on the TRB as well as on enterprise data initiatives. So before I get into the Data Summit recap, just a little bit of context adding to what Paul already shared. Before the start of the summit and at the beginning of the summit, Rajiv and George laid out some key challenges for the attendees. If you look at sort of the mega trends in the industry around you, things like social and cloud apps and analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, what have you, the foundation for all of these trends is really big data and the big data ecosystem of technologies. So these technologies bring a whole new, entirely new paradigm of doing data engineering and data processing. So the challenge laid out was, how do we leverage some of these new ways of doing things and new technologies in building a CMS enterprise data backplane that brings some of these benefits and features and also able to manage some of the challenges that inevitably come with it. So what I'm going to cover here in the next 10 to 12 minutes is just a very high-level distillation of some of the outcomes and key objectives, going forward objectives that came out of the summit and successive discussions after the summit. It hopefully starts to paint a high-level sort of picture of the enterprise data vision going forward. So with that, so the next two slides, we're just going to talk about some of the high-level data objectives, enterprise data objectives going forward. The first one is to build an enterprise data lake focused on all of CMS's structured data along the different domains. Now, just a little bit more color to this particular bullet. Now, there's a lot of definitions of data lakes out there, all the way from one end of the spectrum to it being a hoarding zone for all kinds of data that's processed by consumers, to the other end of the spectrum where you have structured data that's fully cataloged and organized, has governance and process, and is imminently usable. So our goal is to have this data lake be on the other latter end of the spectrum. The second point is that this is not a new IT system or an IT program. This is really a union or a republic of existing data efforts and data programs within the enterprise, but each of them basically following the same data patterns and design patterns and engineering practices so that we can all collectively present a cohesive sort of front to the enterprise collectively. The third is, like Paul mentioned, central to all of this is segregation of storage and compute. The latest set of big data technologies and the cloud infrastructures allow us to do that at scale and effectively. So that's, again, central to The next bullet is really the main takeaway from this bullet, and this is sort of a vestige of the early days of big data. As the technology was evolving, there was still a distinction between data lakes and data warehouses, primarily because the technologies hadn't scaled and evolved to the speed and efficiency required to perform other use cases. But this distinction, as these technologies have matured and moved to the cloud, this distinction is obviously blurred. But the main takeaway on this bullet is really to build this data lake that supports a wide variety of use cases, whether it's warehousing or querying or analytics and APIs. It should be ready to sort of support a wide variety of use cases based on the compute that you bring to the data. The obvious benefit this brings is it allows data owners and data creators to focus on their data and just the data quality and data curation, and let the consumers decide on the consumption mechanics and what kind of compute makes sense to them from the perspective of their use cases, and bring that sort of compute to the data to satisfy their needs. The next two are obvious. The last one is really, we don't want to have any blind sort of dark spots within this data lake. All of the data that comes in is structured, is fully cataloged, is available to any compute that you bring to the data lake on an immediate basis. Continuing the objectives, so we would like for the data lake to support a wide variety of use cases, and that is possible with the segregation of storage and the variety of different computes supporting different use cases that you can bring to the data. From a data lake perspective, the data lake itself is going to be fully open source and open data, open standards based. It does not prevent users from bringing compute, open source or non-open source compute to the data to satisfy their consumption needs. But from the data lake perspective, it's going to be all open source based. The metadata layer is really the key. It's the glue that binds the compute to the data. It's also the data catalog, allows computes to discover what's in the data lake and be able to query and leverage the data lake seamlessly. This is just a high-level concept of operations for the data lake. All of the three pillars in the middle are part of the data lake. The distinction being in the landing zone, the data is as close as possible. It's all of the data in all of these three pillars is structured and cataloged and maintained in the metadata catalog. The distinction, the landing zone has data as close as possible to the source data sets. There are consumers that might need that kind of a service. The standardization zone is basically where data is transformed for for a multitude of purposes. You might create link layers, you might transform data to add business value, you might create a business semantic layer. So all of that goes into the standardization zone. The analytics sandbox is really for data scientist type use cases when data scientists are using, and data scientist type tools typically work against a data lake backplane. So as they work on these data sets, they tend to muddy the data. They tend to process it, create transformations. So that gives them a sandbox to be able to play around with the data, do machine learning, what have you. Now, there could be data assets that come out of that sandbox that might have value for the larger enterprise. Those will come back and sit in the standardization zone. So as you can see, going from the left to the right, it's data governance heavy on the left, while as you go to the right, it gets more data ops. So how do we get there? So like I mentioned, this is really an alignment of existing and new data efforts across the agency in terms of moving to this reference model. And second, in terms of these data efforts, whether they're data efforts that are moving to the cloud or new efforts, re-engineering efforts, aligning them to the same sort of engineering techniques and design patterns and best practices. So that's really how we're trying to move this forward in creation of a virtual enterprise data lake. In terms of the core technical patterns, there's really three key ones, and there's a lot of engineering that goes behind each one of this, but these are the three key patterns that would be part of this data lake. The first one is segregation of storage and compute. We would be using block storage like S3, and we only mention S3 because that's one example, but it could be S3 in AWS or Azure Data Lake Storage in Azure. We would store data in standard formats like Parquet or ORC. The data is, and we'll talk about each of these in future slides, the data is partitioned, and it's Hive partitioned and maintained in the metadata catalog. That's the third one. So this is just to sort of paint a picture of, so the lowest layer, which is the storage and metastore, that's what the data lake is. So it's basically going to be storage, object storage with all of the partitioned, cataloged, categorized data stored in the object storage, and the metadata catalog basically having all of the metadata information about the data lake within the catalog. Everything above that, whether it's processing, querying, analytics, all of that compute comes and goes based on creators of the data, their preference in terms of what makes sense for their data pipelines, consumers in terms of what makes sense for their use cases. So all of that is transient infrastructure that comes and goes depending on what the use cases are. And each consumer is free to bring their own compute to the data. And again, to one of the points Paul mentioned, not step over each other in terms of workloads and such. So I'll go over these very high level. So again, the key takeaway on this slide is open standards, open format. The data lake's going to be more read intensive, so we're primarily focused on Parquet and ORC as the data formats in the data lake. Hive partitioning is really key for us. This is key to maintaining a performant data lake for all use cases. And it also enables massively parallel processing, which is a very common architectural concept in pretty much every big data tool. And bucketing is another concept we would employ as well. The centralized metastore is the metadata catalog. I also want to make a distinction here between the Hive metadata catalog and another term, data catalog. They both have a role to play. The data catalog is more of a user-facing component where users discover data assets that might be available and collaborate potentially with other users. The Hive metastore is a technical enabler. It's more of a technical glue that binds compute to the data lake. It stores information about partitions, what data assets are available, and it allows computes to bind to the data. So irrespective of where the data is coming from, what transformations the data are going through, or where it's being consumed, all of the metadata for the data lake is stored consistently in a centralized metastore. And the centralized metastore is in this architecture, the only component that's going to have an enterprise footprint. The data lakes itself is an amalgamation of data assets across the enterprise. These are just some of the efforts that are currently moving towards this data pattern. And like Paul said, over the next couple of months, we should see some significant progress coming out of each of these. Back to Paul.
So I have a question for David. Imagine how your job would be much easier in 20 years if we didn't have to have as much data movement because people could bring their compute to the data, or we keep piggybacking on those APIs that Yadira builds. So it's a rhetorical question, obviously, but let's just look at this slide for a minute, because you're going to always have to have a very strong presence within OIT, just the way it works in this building. I've been here for a long time. We've got to have a strong center, although we are democratizing how we go about our data management here. We've got some very strong data organizations. You know, Yadira's got a heck of a team there, and we've got CCSQ and a whole bunch of other CMCS. But there's always going to be that need for someone in the middle to try to hold the center. And I was very pleased to see what the IDR team is looking at. They're making some really good progress. Medicaid, they've been maybe the first that went after some of these concepts when Jack Fletcher was here, and that team continues with was it Roth, Barb Roth, and others are making it. Yeah. And then master data management, you're doing a pilot there, proof of concept.
With Helen, yeah.
Beneficiary in the cloud. I'm working in the marketplace. We've got some good stuff that we're working on as well. So I think that list probably is just the beginning, but those are just some of but there's others, is the point I'm making. There's a bunch of stuff going on. So did we have any questions? I had questions for you, David. All right. All right, so we get out of here. You have one. Okay. Hey.
Gary Rubalski, Spark South. Congratulations, first of all, on all this exciting stuff. Yadira, for the, I guess, a little bit of an API side, where is CMS headed with EHR? As far as I know, medical records today are still either mailed in, CDs, ESMD potentially, but where does EHR plug into CMS today and maybe 5 years down the road?
So I know that CMS and ONC are pushing hard to create or to disband the silos that were created through meaningful use, where a lot of vendors were, a lot of doctors and hospitals were encouraged strongly to move to technology instead of paper-based. That really evolved into a full industry of EHRs, but each of those was really individually siloed, and data was difficult to get across all of them. So a beneficiary went to 5 different doctors. Their medical information was in different locations. I think with the interoperability rule, they're trying to change that. They're really pushing more standards-based, such as HL7 Fire, to create this transparency and this data sharing across all of the EHR vendors, including CMS. I think that we have been fortunate in the work that we've done. We've really been leading by example that this can be done. And we're proving it every single day. So I expect a huge evolution, I think, in the vendor industry as people start looking more and more, not just of getting that data on the beneficiaries, but actually sharing it and making sure that that data follows the beneficiary throughout their life. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
Good morning, Mark Potter from New Wave. Thank you for your panel. One of the questions that I had was related to sort of the security and privacy side of things. The system that comes to mind, if you look at how DESI works and how it essentially leverages, it checks the EUA, it checks EPI to essentially see what data usage agreements are permitted. And then that essentially informs the extraction that gets sent over. And of course, you have the concepts as well. Different systems are set up with different privacy impact analysis, as well as related to certain SORNs. So I'm just wondering, from a data lake perspective, I was in some of those meetings with HHS-OIG and Jack Fletcher and Aramac, and talking about, HHS-OIG was saying, how do we bring our compute to your data? We don't want a flat file anymore that we're going to load into our own Oracle database. So along those lines, in order to support the right side of your diagram, where you've got your data scientists that are looking for access to a less structured environment, how do we sort of set the guardrails in terms of the DUAs and the PIA and the SORNs?
So part of what we're moving to is a collaborative engagement, because if the data's in one place and it's, we've got a smaller army that's keeping that going, then how you use it and the governance becomes a big deal. And I love your question, and would love, maybe we could talk after this, because I think maybe if you're passionate about that, you could help us work on that. So let me get to that. So when we were thinking through, if you go to the Confluence site for the last API and Data Summit, in there we talked about what we might do in the next. And in the next one, we talked to the privacy officer, Mike Poggles, and Tom Shankweiler, who I know is over on the security side. So that particular topic, is you're at CMS longer than most, which is where I'm at in my career now, security and privacy become very big. I mean, it becomes probably the biggest thing, right? So at least where I sit right now, try to protect the image of CMS as best we can. So that is where I was thinking that, you know, between now and May, I would like to have some workshops with, and Mike Poggles and Tom Shankweiler and that team said that they would be more than willing to work with us. But that's a topic where I think, you know, before we would go turn this thing on, the governance, and it's not just the, you know, security, privacy is a big deal, but who contributes the data? Who consumes it? Because we want to get the intermediacy. We want to get that lean thinking throughout our new architecture. You don't have to have these monkeys in the middle anymore like you do in a big data warehouse where the team just grabs all the data and puts it in. And they grab so much data they forget what the data is about because they're just trying to make sure that the data goes from point A to point B correctly. The new model would be the teams that create the data, put the data in, and so that would be a sort of a different type of governance model. But then how does the system of record, the DUA, you know, the DUAs, all that, how does all that work? And we think we can build a framework around that from the get-go. So if we're thinking about it right up where we're at, because we're just doing proof of concepts, that's what we, you know, I appreciate your reminder because we've got so many things on our plate. Sometimes we lose track of obligations we've already sort of talked about. So that, I will take that if we could talk afterwards, because I would like, and that's the other thing we were trying to do is to get these work groups started where it wasn't just feds, it was contractors and feds. So, you know, I'll take that as an action item. We'll get with Mike Poggles and the security folks and get Majid. We'll take that up to maybe George and others. I'm sure they're going to be very supportive of that. To lay that kind of governance thinking in before we even take too many steps, I think would be very prudent. So that's a good question.
Yeah, and just we're also looking at data lake access control and governance tools that'll sort of keep, you know, enforce some of those DUAs. So. And
look how important, and maybe it's fortuitous, but we had the LDAP folks here, and you know, at some point, all that what we're doing with the security protocols coming in, that all kind of fits together too. So it would be there's the governance and the sort of the legal and regulatory kind of stuff we have to do, but then there's going to be the physical implementation we have to worry about too. So. We'll take that into advisement. Okay, keep going.
Good morning. This is Srinivas Malampalli. This is with respect to that one of the slides where you mentioned master data management. Is there a specific product that you are planning to implement, or are you planning to build your own rules for the master data management?
I think we could have a couple answers to that. I think where we're at, first of all, CMS has a very big footprint, and we've got very diverse needs. So one of the challenges I think George has and others is, you know, you got to give direction, but then you can't give so much that you're locking people into solutions that may not work for them. So we just have a very diverse set of organizations and need. But there are some patterns that we want to kind of promote, and that's what Majid's talking about. And I think at some point we are going to have to look at, if you got data in one place, by definition, you're going to have fewer tools. And I don't know that we're at the place of making that decision yet. I think there's a lot of experimentation going on right now, and I think that's a healthy thing. But I could see within a year or two that we're going to have to make some very hard choices. But I think, you know, because then there's open source, but you know, we know open source might be free, but it's not necessarily cheap. You know, so there's value to some of the managed open source. So, but Majid, did you have
No, I think you covered it. I mean, there's a whole MDM team that builds that, but they're using the data lake as a backdrop to be able to build that capability.
Yeah. So so tools, methods, integration patterns, governance. You know, that was some of the stuff we talked about. You know, how do you even capitalize a shared asset? Where does the budget come in? I mean, you know, I'm thinking it's got to come right off the top. But I mean, these are kind of challenges that once we prove to management and our executive that we can do data engineering at CMS in a more compact, reuse, you know, more efficient way, then we're going to have to think about some of those other, you know, how do you pay for it? How do you incentivize folks to tap into this rather than rebuilding their own silo? So those are questions we know we've got to answer, but we wanted to have a little bit more proof in the pudding, see where this is at first. And I think that's why we were saying May might be a good time, because we know that there's a lot of really outstanding effort going on, and May might be a time for us to catch where we're at one more time, and then maybe September of next year we start with some different type of planning that we've not done before, because we would have experience then. This would not be just theoretic. We hope to have some real examples, but we can only take those next steps and after we've got some real proof that there are new patterns and what those patterns are and what the implications of those new ways of doing business mean to us. So that's where I think I'll come back to what Ashley was talking about, that maybe every 12 years or so we have to rethink and put new plans in place. Even if they are less centralized command and control and more collaborative. And that's a big shift, but I think that's the shift that's happening. Sort of open source for data, I think, is the way I think of it. All right. I think
Do we have any questions on the phone? WebEx moderator?
At this time, I do not see any questions.
Okay. Anybody else in the room? Come on back up.
All right. We've got time.
All right, one more question. A concept that is not new, Bill Inman and Claudia Emhoff came up with this concept of essentially a data factory. And so where you have the concept of data warehouses, and you're not necessarily producing the results for an individual query, but you're producing intermediate result sets. I've just been thinking about a lot as I've been looking at CCW and IDR, and there's a lot of specific point requests that they're responding to. And and it looks like in your architecture you're already thinking about this, but I'm wondering whether or not we can take some of the heavy lifting off of the individual contractor systems that are looking to do their local processing of the data and essentially have IDR and CCW serve as data factories where they can produce essentially deliverables, drop them into different S3 buckets to be consumed by those end systems.
You deal with CCW, don't you, Yadira? Well, so I think there might be a couple answers to that. But that's the exact kind of thinking that we all need to, because there's a shift that's happened, right? So like whether people want to believe it or not, the cloud, and then with S3, and then there's like this, the first generation of cloud was really just trying to get the compute and the networks together and the hardware devices. And now what you're seeing is a whole next generation on the data side. So we're finally getting our due and our day. And so it has profound implications. The more you think about it, so I'm with you on that. And I even have and it's not just me, because there was a bunch of folks about 3 years ago. Mark Hogle allowed me to go off and get with a bunch of really smart feds and contractors and think about what data computing might look like in the cloud. And so I had the freedom to work on that for a while. And what became apparent is that not only can we have much more reuse on the analytics space, but I know at least on the marketplace, we spend more money on operations. So in my mind as a data architect, there's transactional systems, there's operational systems, and there's analytics. And the operational systems, say like a next generation NGD. Next generation. It's a misnomer. Never did get that one. But the customer outreach. We have dozens of systems. What I would put forth, we spend more money on those. Reaching out to the providers, reaching out to the consumer, the bennies, the recipients, and the consumers. That's where, but all of them, they all take, the 25 billion or whatever, how many billions? It's, a lot of billions of claims, a lot of billions of enrollment records, encounter records. And so we have just all this redundancy, and there's no need for that. They could just be tapping into much more authoritative data, because if you had data in less places, more eyes on the same thing, the data quality is going to go up just by definition, right? So I guess I'm filibustering a little bit. I'll get to Yadira, but I think operations. I just think there's a lot of money that we could be saving. And then the other thing is, like, you're not capturing. Like, if you go off and you have an encounter with the insurance companies or the providers or the bennies, that's all staying in those silos. So not only do they have copies of data, they also have silos of just little bits of the data that we really would need to have all that for a 360-degree view of the data. And of course, we need 360-degree views of the data if we're going to do machine learning and train our models right. So we didn't even get into that.
I've had the fortune of working both on the IDR and now most recently with the CCW. I think that they both develop data products that meet consumers' needs. If you look at the IDR, they're really focused on internal data sharing, and their primary data product is the VDM that they develop. All of their data is in its most raw form as they can get it in the Teradata platform, and they try to level that up a little bit with the different VDMs to give you guys the access that you guys need to the information. But because it is so detailed, it's hard to continue to roll that up into smaller and smaller, more consumable increments. It's really powerful in the way that it is all laid out and giving you that detailed information. The CCW is focused on external data sharing. And if you look at data.cms.gov, 80% of the publicly available data files out there are developed from the CCW team. So there is definitely a lot of information that is provided through these two large warehouses in very different forms. So I think that that will continue and definitely evolve as we continue to mature our products and the infrastructure that we're utilizing.
But they both share the same primitives. In other words, there's still core data sets that we could have in a data lake, and that could even tap back into, because I know John Evangelist is doing some work with digital services, and so there's a lot that we can do and we can think through to use less data movement. But I agree, I think it's a nice divide where maybe CCW would be the external agent, and it would include APIs as well, right? So API and dissemination, and then maybe something like an IDR, but I don't want to put words in their mouth, because they have their own. But you could see a centralized data store that would handle a lot of the internal operations. You could see that. That to me is pretty straightforward, but it'd only take about 20 years to build it. Watching off, did you have any ideas there?
No, you
all right, we're good. And who are you with again? Oh, you're New Wave. Okay. See, that's the thing. No, we guess there's a lot of great contractors out there. There really are. And that's maybe something that the feds have to work. And that's what we were trying to do in these summits, is try to get the value and the vision of some of the private sector to work with the feds, and a little bit more, informal kind of, just as an advisor. So maybe that's something we'll keep trying to work on. All right.
So thank you. Very informative. So again, we've got the live polling. Let us know how we're doing. For those of you that are external, that want notice about when Tech Topic sessions are coming up, there's a subscription service through GovDelivery. If you need information on it, you can email us at ctos@cms.hhs.gov. Materials will be posted, or actually are already out, on the CMS Technical Insights community on Zone. Again, if you need registration instructions, you can use that email address to request them. For CMS, we have the materials out on SharePoint, and the video itself that we're actually recording the session will also be posted to the SharePoint site, but not to Zone. Our next session will be in 2020. January 23rd is the scheduled one. Hopefully we won't have inclement weather and have to reschedule that. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at cms.gov, #CMSConverge. Thank you again. Have a happy holiday, or holidays.